I always thought I was the kind of guy who would know when something was wrong. You know the type. The one who can read his wife's mood from a single glance, who remembers the small details and picks up on those little shifts that signal something's off. But here I am, standing in the kitchen, the dull hum of the refrigerator, the only sound as I stare down at my phone, my stomach knotting tighter with every word I read. Julia's phone is lying right there on the counter, next to her coffee cup. It buzzed while she was in the shower. I hadn't meant to look. It was instinctive. And there it was. A message from Dr. Harris, the guy we'd been seeing for marriage counseling. Except this wasn't a professional message, not by any means. Can't stop thinking about last night, the way you moaned my name. Jesus, Julia. My hand tightened around the phone, knuckles going white. The words burned into my brain like a brand. I read them again, hoping they'd change, that they'd turn into something else, something that wouldn't rip my world apart. But no, they stayed the same, each word digging deeper into me. I dropped the phone back onto the counter, heart pounding in my chest, breath coming in shallow bursts. My mind raced, trying to process it all. Julia, with Dr. Harris? The man we'd trusted with our most private thoughts, the one who was supposed to help us. My wife, my Julia. Moaning his name, a part of me wanted to storm upstairs, fling open the bathroom door, and confront her right then and there. Demand an explanation. But what good would that do? What could she possibly say that would make this okay? I wasn't sure if I was angrier at her, at him, or at myself for not seeing it sooner. All those late sessions, the private talks she'd insisted on having with him, saying it was part of the therapy. I hadn't questioned it. Why would I? He was our therapist, after all. He was supposed to be helping us. I felt sick, like the ground had been pulled out from under me, and I was free-falling into some kind of abyss. I clenched my fists, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside me. No, I couldn't confront her, not yet. I needed more. I needed to understand why. What had driven her into his arms? Was I not enough? Had I missed some crucial sign along the way? I forced myself to take deep breaths, steadying my mind. If I went into this blindly, I'd lose. I needed to think, to plan. Storming upstairs and accusing her would just blow everything up without giving me the answers I needed. The shower turned off upstairs, and I heard the faint sounds of Julia moving around in the bathroom. I shoved my phone into my pocket, my mind racing. I couldn't let her see how rattled I was. Not yet. Not until I had more to go on. I needed to play this carefully, strategically. I grabbed a coffee mug, pretending to make myself busy when Julia finally came down. She walked into the kitchen, a towel wrapped around her damp hair, her face fresh and calm like nothing had happened, like she wasn't sleeping with the man who was supposed to be saving our marriage. "Morning," she said with a soft smile, leaning in to kiss me on the cheek. I flinched, just barely, but enough for her to notice. Her eyes flickered with a hint of confusion, but she didn't say anything. She poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. I felt like I was looking at a stranger. The woman in front of me, the one I'd spent years loving, was not the same person I thought I knew. There was something foreign about her now, a distance I hadn't noticed before. Maybe it had always been there, and I just hadn't been paying attention. "You okay?" she asked, her voice casual but with an edge of concern. "You seem off." "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile that felt all wrong on my face. "Just didn't sleep well last night. Work stuff." She nodded, sipping her coffee. I watched her, wondering how she could look so calm, so unaffected, when my whole world was crashing down. Did she feel any guilt? Did she even care? Or had I already become a non-factor in her mind, a background character in her life while she pursued whatever she had with Harris? "I've got a meeting with a new client later," she said, glancing at her watch. "Might be home late. We can order in if you don't feel like cooking." I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, sure. Whatever works." The thought of her being with Harris again, possibly tonight, made my blood boil. But I swallowed the anger. I needed to stay in control. I watched her leave the kitchen, her footsteps echoing in the hallway, and the front door clicked shut a moment later. The house fell silent again, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I stood there, unmoving, for what felt like an eternity, my mind replaying the message over and over again. I couldn't let this go. I couldn't just sit here and pretend everything was fine. But I also couldn't rush into this without a plan. I needed proof, something concrete that would give me the upper hand when I finally confronted her. Dr. Harris, though, he was another story. The more I thought about it, the more it didn't add up. A therapist, a professional, risking his career to seduce a patient? There had to be more to it than that. And if there was, I was going to find out. I grabbed my phone, pulling up Julia's messages again, scrolling through them for more clues. There were a few others, nothing as incriminating as the first, but they were enough to confirm that this wasn't some one-time mistake. This was ongoing. My heart ached with every new message I found, the betrayal cutting deeper with each one. I needed more, though. I needed to know just how deep this went. Dr. Harris, I'd start with him. I couldn't stop thinking about the messages, about Julia and Harris. It consumed me, gnawing at every corner of my mind. I wanted to storm into his office, throw everything on his desk, and demand answers. But that wouldn't get me anywhere. I needed to stay calm, focused. This wasn't just about Julia. There was something off about Harris, something deeper. I spent the rest of the day trying to work, but failing miserably. Every time my mind wandered, it went straight back to the messages, to Julia's calm face that morning, to the way she could look me in the eye and act like everything was fine. How long had she been doing this? How long had I been blind? I needed to know more. That evening, after Julia had left for her meeting, I sat down at my computer and did a little research. Dr. Stephen Harris. He had a good reputation, plenty of positive reviews online, but as I dug deeper, a few things started to stand out. Some of the reviews weren't glowing. A couple of them even hinted at inappropriate behavior, but they were vague, never directly accusing him of anything. That wasn't enough to go on, but it was something. I needed more than just a few bad reviews. I needed hard proof. The next day, I decided to take a risk. I booked an appointment with Harris under a fake name. It wasn't hard to come up with something convincing. After all, I'd been sitting in his office for months, listening to him dissect my marriage, pretending he was there to help. Now, I would be the one dissecting him. The appointment was set for later in the week, giving me time to prepare. In the meantime, I kept up appearances with Julia, acting like nothing had changed. It wasn't easy. Every time she smiled at me or kissed me on the cheek, I had to fight the urge to confront her, to demand to know why she was doing this. But I held back. I had to. I needed more than just her words. I needed the truth. When the day of the appointment finally arrived, I was ready. I arrived at Harris's office early, checking in under my fake name. The receptionist didn't seem to suspect anything, and within a few minutes, I was led into the same office I'd sat in so many times before. Harris greeted me with a smile, the same professional demeanor he always had, as if nothing had changed. But I knew better. "So, what brings you in today?" he asked, settling into his chair. I hesitated for a moment, trying to think of the best way to approach this. I couldn't come out too strong. I had to play it cool. "I've been having some trouble at home," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Things with my wife, they haven't been great. I thought maybe talking to someone could help." Harris nodded, his expression serious. "Marriage can be difficult. I've seen a lot of couples go through rough patches. Sometimes, it just takes time and communication." I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me, but I kept it in check. I wasn't here to get help. I was here to expose him. "Yeah, that's what I thought too," I said, leaning forward slightly. "But then I found out my wife's been seeing someone else, someone she's supposed to trust, someone like her therapist." Harris didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He just nodded again, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. "That's unfortunate," he said, his voice still calm. "It happens more often than you might think. People in vulnerable positions can sometimes make decisions they wouldn't normally make." I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. He was talking about my wife like she was just another statistic, another patient who'd fallen into his trap. "So, what do you do in a situation like that?" I asked, my voice tight. "When someone like a therapist crosses the line?" Harris finally looked at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Are you saying that's what happened with your wife?" I could see it now, the shift in his demeanor. He wasn't just the calm, collected therapist anymore. He was on guard. I don't know, I said, keeping my voice steady, but it sure seems that way. Harris leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. If a therapist has crossed a line, there are avenues to report it, he said, but you'd need proof. Without that, it's just speculation. I nodded, pretending to consider his words. But inside, I was seething. He was trying to cover his tracks, trying to make it seem like this was all in my head. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. Thanks, I said, standing up abruptly. I'll think about that. Harris stood as well, offering me his hand. If you ever need to talk again, my door is always open. I shook his hand, barely able to keep the disgust off my face. I walked out of his office, my mind racing. He hadn't denied it, not outright at least, but he was right about one thing. I needed proof. I couldn't just confront him or Julia without something concrete. Over the next few days, I started watching Julia more closely, paying attention to her every move. She was careful, I'll give her that. She didn't leave any obvious signs of her affair, nothing that would raise suspicion. But I knew what I was looking for now. I started checking her phone whenever she left it unattended, digging through her messages and emails. It didn't take long to find more evidence. Late-night texts to Harris, calls made when she thought I wasn't around, even a few hotel reservations under her name. The more I found, the more it made my blood boil. This wasn't just some fling. This was an ongoing, calculated betrayal. But something else started to bother me too. The messages between Julia and Harris weren't just casual. They were deliberate. Almost like Harris was guiding her, pushing her toward something. It wasn't just about their affair. It was about breaking us apart. That's when I realized this wasn't just about him and Julia. There was something bigger at play here. I started digging into Harris's background, looking for anything that could explain what he was doing. It wasn't easy. On the surface, he was clean, too clean. No major scandals, no complaints that had stuck. But there were whispers. I found a few articles, some old complaints filed by former patients that had been quietly settled or dismissed. One of them, in particular, stood out. A woman had accused Harris of manipulating her into leaving her husband, claiming that he had preyed on her vulnerability. The case had been thrown out for lack of evidence, but the similarities to my situation were too close to ignore. I wasn't dealing with just an affair. Harris was a predator, someone who manipulated vulnerable people for his own gain. And if that was true, then Julia wasn't just a willing participant. She was a victim, too. But that didn't make it any easier. She had still betrayed me, still lied to me. I didn't know how to feel about her anymore. But one thing was clear. I couldn't let Harris get away with this. I needed to find out just how deep this went. I started following the money. I checked our bank accounts, looking for anything that seemed out of place. Sure enough, there were a few strange transactions, large sums of money being moved around, payments that didn't make sense. I couldn't figure it all out, but I knew one thing for sure. Harris was involved. This wasn't just about breaking up marriages for fun. There was a financial angle, too. He was profiting from this somehow, and I was going to find out how. I started keeping detailed notes, tracking everything I found. I was building a case, one that I could take to the authorities, or at least to the media. Harris thought he was untouchable, but I was going to prove him wrong. But as I got closer to the truth, things started to get dangerous. I started receiving anonymous threats, phone calls in the middle of the night, telling me to back off. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but the more I dug, the more frequent they became. Harris knew I was onto him, and he wasn't going to let me expose him without a fight. But I wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when I was so close to getting the proof I needed. I just had to be careful. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. I didn't know who I could trust anymore. Julia, I didn't even know if she was aware of the full extent of what was happening, but I couldn't risk confronting her yet. Not until I had everything I needed. I wasn't just fighting for my marriage anymore. I was fighting for the truth. I knew I had to be more careful now. The threats had started to feel too real, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I left the house, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, my nerves on edge, like someone could jump out of the shadows at any moment. But that didn't stop me. If anything, it pushed me harder. I needed to know what Harris was really up to, and I needed proof to bring him down. I kept up the charade with Julia, pretending like everything was fine at home. She'd grown more distant in the last few weeks, probably thinking I hadn't noticed. But I had. I noticed everything now. Her texts to Harris had increased, and she was disappearing more often, always with some flimsy excuse that I didn't bother to challenge. I didn't have to. The hotel receipts and secret meetings spoke for themselves. But as much as the anger surged in me every time I thought of her with him, I couldn't forget that this was bigger than her infidelity. Harris was dangerous, manipulative, and this wasn't just about my marriage anymore. This was about stopping him before he destroyed someone else's life like he had destroyed mine. So I kept digging. Late nights in front of the computer, scouring financial records, legal filings, anything that might show a connection between Harris and the shady transactions I'd found. I learned that Harris had some ties to a group of high-profile divorce attorneys. Nothing illegal on the surface, but it didn't take a genius to figure out what was happening. He was targeting wealthy couples, manipulating their relationships until they fell apart, and then profiting from the resulting divorce settlements. It was a racket, plain and simple, and Julia was just another pawn in his game. The deeper I got into the investigation, the more convinced I became that I needed to take action soon. But I couldn't go to the police with half-baked theories and hunches. I needed hard evidence. And that's when I realized what I had to do. I needed to confront Julia. Not to accuse her, but to warn her. If I waited any longer, she could end up as collateral damage, caught in the fallout of whatever Harris was planning. That night, I waited until she got home. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept much, and I wondered if the guilt was finally starting to catch up to her. Or maybe she was just exhausted from keeping up the act. I watched her move around the kitchen, her movements slower than usual, more deliberate. I couldn't help but wonder if this was the same woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. Was this version of her a stranger, or had I just been blind to who she really was? "Julia," I said, breaking the silence. She glanced up at me, her expression guarded. "We need to talk." Her shoulders tensed, and she didn't respond right away. She finished pouring herself a glass of wine and took a sip before finally turning to face me. "About what?" I could hear the defensiveness in her voice, the edge that came with it. She already knew what this was about. "I know about you and Harris," I said, keeping my voice calm, measured. I didn't want to start a fight. I just wanted her to listen. Her eyes widened for a split second before she quickly composed herself. "What are you talking about?" she asked, feigning ignorance. "Don't play dumb, Julia. I've seen the messages. I've seen the hotel bookings. I know everything." She stood there, frozen, her face a mask of shock and guilt. But then, just as quickly, her expression hardened. "So what, you've been spying on me? Going through my stuff?" "That's not the point, and you know it," I said, trying to keep my anger in check. "Harris has been manipulating you. This isn't just some affair. He's using you, using us, to make money. He's done this before, and he'll do it again. You're just another mark to him." Julia's face twisted in disbelief. "That's insane. Stephen, Dr. Harris, cares about me. He's been helping me get through this mess that our marriage has become." I shook my head. "He doesn't care about you, Julia. He's using you. I've been looking into him, and it's all connected. He's working with lawyers, profiting off the divorces he helps engineer. It's a scam, and you're part of it." She stared at me, her eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and confusion. "You've lost it," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "This is all just some paranoid fantasy you've cooked up because you can't handle the fact that I'm leaving you. Julia, listen to me," I pleaded, stepping closer to her. "I'm trying to help you. I don't care about the affair anymore. This is bigger than that. Harris is dangerous, and if you stay involved with him, he'll ruin you. Please, just look at what I've found." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folder I'd been keeping, the printouts of the financial records, the old complaints, the connections to the attorneys. I handed it to her, hoping, praying that she'd at least look at it. But instead, she slapped it out of my hand, the papers scattering across the floor. "I don't need to see this," she snapped. "I don't need you trying to play detective and telling me what to do. You think you're helping, but you're just making everything worse. I'm done, Mark. I'm done with you, with this marriage, with all of it." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stood there, stunned, as she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at the scattered papers on the floor, the weight of everything crashing down on me. She was gone. She was really gone. And as much as it hurt, I knew I couldn't stop now. I had to keep going, had to expose Harris for what he really was. Even if Julia didn't want to believe me, I wasn't going to let him win. The next day, I made an appointment with a private investigator. I needed someone who could get me the hard evidence I couldn't find on my own. Someone who could dig into Harris's finances, his connections, and everything he was trying to keep hidden. I wasn't going to stop until I had everything I needed to bring him down. The investigator, a woman named Sarah, listened carefully as I explained the situation. She didn't seem surprised by any of it. Apparently, she'd seen cases like this before. "These guys are smart," she said, leaning back in her chair. "They cover their tracks well, but no one's perfect. If there's something to find, I'll find it." I left her office feeling a little more hopeful, but still on edge. I knew this wasn't going to be easy, and I knew it wasn't going to happen overnight. But at least now, I had someone in my corner, someone who knew how to navigate the system and uncover the truth. In the meantime, I had to keep up appearances. I couldn't let Harris or Julia know that I was still digging. If they suspected anything, they'd shut everything down, and I'd be left with nothing. So I went back to work, pretended like everything was normal, even though inside, I was a wreck. Every time I thought about Julia, about her with Harris, it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. But I couldn't afford to be emotional right now. I had to stay focused. A week went by with no word from Julia. I didn't try to contact her. What was the point? She'd made her choice. All I could do now was wait for Sarah to come back with something concrete. When she finally called, I could tell from her tone that she had found something big. "You're going to want to see this in person," she said, her voice serious. "Meet me at my office tomorrow." I barely slept that night, my mind racing with possibilities. What had she found? Was it enough to bring Harris down? Was it enough to finally prove to Julia that I was right? The next morning, I arrived at Sarah's office, my heart pounding in my chest. She greeted me with a grim expression and led me to her desk, where a file was waiting. "I followed the money," she said, flipping open the folder. "Harris is definitely involved in some shady dealings. He's been funneling money through shell companies, and there are several payments linked to high-profile divorces. But that's not all." She pulled out a document and handed it to me. "This is a contract between Harris and a law firm that specializes in divorce cases. He's been getting kickbacks for every client he refers to them, and your wife's name is on the list." I stared at the document, the words blurring in front of me as the full weight of it hit me. Harris wasn't just manipulating Julia, he was profiting off of her, off of us, and now I had the proof I needed to take him down. But as I looked at the file, a new thought crossed my mind. If Harris knew I was on to him, he wouldn't go down quietly, and Julia, she could still be in danger. This wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. When Sarah handed me the contract showing Julia's name linked to Harris's scheme, I felt a hollow pit open in my chest. It wasn't just about their affair anymore. It was far worse than that. She was tangled up in a conspiracy, her name dragged into something so much bigger and more dangerous than I ever could have imagined. My gut twisted as I stared at the document, the legal jargon dancing across the pages as my mind struggled to process the implications. "How deep does this go?" I finally asked, my voice low, almost afraid of the answer. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her eyes hard. "Pretty deep. Harris has been running this operation for years, by the looks of it. He preys on vulnerable couples, convinces the spouses he's involved with to leave their marriages, then profits from the divorces through kickbacks from lawyers and other shady deals. Your wife isn't the first, and she won't be the last if we don't stop him." I clenched my fists in my lap, trying to keep my anger in check. I didn't want to explode. Not here. Not yet. But the thought of Harris using Julia like this, turning her into just another one of his puppets, made my blood boil. "Is there enough here to take to the police?" I asked, needing to know if this could finally end, if we could shut Harris down before he destroyed anyone else's life. Sarah hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. It's tricky. We have financial records, sure, and this contract is a smoking gun, but Harris is smart. He's covered his tracks well enough that it might take a lot more to bring him down. The police will need solid evidence of direct manipulation, proof that he's coercing his patients into these decisions. Right now, it still looks like your wife and the others made these choices willingly. My heart sank. Of course, it wasn't going to be that easy. It never was. I knew Julia wasn't acting willingly. She'd been manipulated, steered in a direction by someone she trusted. But proving that to the authorities, that was a whole other battle. So, what do we do next? I asked, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. We keep digging, Sarah said. I'll gather more intel, see if I can track down any of his former patients. If we can find someone who's willing to talk, someone who's been through this and come out the other side, we might be able to build a stronger case. But it's going to take time, Mark. This isn't something we can solve overnight. I nodded, though the frustration was gnawing at me. Time. That was the one thing I felt like I didn't have. Every day that passed was another day Harris could dig his claws deeper into Julia's life, into her mind. And if I didn't act fast, I could lose her completely, if I hadn't already. I left Sarah's office with the file tucked under my arm, the weight of it feeling like a physical burden. My mind raced as I drove home, thinking about what the next steps had to be. Sarah was right. We needed more time, more proof. But I couldn't sit on the sidelines and wait while Harris continued his manipulation. I had to do something, even if it was risky. When I got home, the house was dark. Julia still hadn't come back, and I wasn't sure when or if she would. I wasn't ready to confront her again, not yet. Not without a plan, but I knew I had to act quickly. Harris wasn't just going to sit around waiting for me to figure things out. He was too smart for that. I went to my computer and began pulling up everything I could find on Harris's practice. Patient reviews, legal filings, anything that might point me in the direction of former clients who had been manipulated like Julia. I spent hours combing through the information, my eyes burning from the strain, but it felt like I was getting nowhere. Harris had covered his tracks well, just like Sarah said. He wasn't the kind of man to leave loose ends. Frustration boiled over, and I slammed my fist down on the desk. How had I let it come to this? How had I missed all the signs, let Julia get so far out of reach? If I had just been paying attention, maybe I could have stopped this before it spiraled so far out of control. But it was too late for that now. The only thing I could do was keep pushing forward. I was about to shut down the computer when I saw something, a small article buried deep in an old newspaper archive. It was from years ago, an interview with a woman who had been involved in a high-profile divorce case. She talked about how her therapist had encouraged her to leave her husband, convinced her that she needed to break free for her own mental health. The therapist's name wasn't mentioned, but the details were eerily familiar. I pulled up the article and read through it again, my heart pounding. Could this be one of Harris's former patients? It was a long shot, but it was the only lead I had. I jotted down the woman's name and did a quick search online. After some digging, I found her contact information, an email address. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I composed a message explaining who I was and what I was trying to uncover. I didn't go into too much detail, not wanting to scare her off, but I made it clear that I believed she might have been involved with Harris in a way similar to Julia. I hit send, hoping that she'd respond, that she might be willing to talk. The next few days were torture. I kept checking my email, waiting for a reply that never came. At the same time, I kept up appearances with Julia, even though the tension between us was palpable. She avoided me whenever she could, staying out late and spending more time at Harris's office. It was like she was already gone, like the woman I'd married had slipped away, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. Then, one evening, I got the email I'd been waiting for. It was from the woman in the article. Her name was Linda, and she was willing to meet. She didn't give me much information in the email, just a time and place to meet in a small coffee shop on the other side of town. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my keys and headed out, my heart pounding with anticipation. When I arrived at the coffee shop, Linda was already there, sitting at a corner table with her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. She looked nervous, her eyes darting around the room as if she was afraid someone might be watching her. I approached cautiously, not wanting to startle her. "Linda?" I asked softly as I reached the table. She looked up at me and nodded. "Mark, right?" I sat down across from her, my mind racing with questions. But I had to be careful. I didn't want to scare her off before I got the information I needed. "Thank you for meeting with me," I said. "I know this must be hard for you." She nodded again, her fingers tightening around the cup. "It's not something I like to talk about," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But when I got your email, I knew I had to. Because I've been there, Mark. I've been exactly where your wife is now." My heart clenched at her words. "What happened?" I asked, leaning forward. "How did Harris manipulate you?" Linda took a deep breath, her eyes flicking to the window, as if she was still afraid of being watched. "It started out innocent enough," she said. "I was going through a rough patch with my husband, and I started seeing Harris for therapy. He seemed like a good guy at first, really cared about what I was going through. But then things started to change. He began telling me that my husband was the problem, that I needed to focus on myself, that I'd be better off without him. At first, I didn't think much of it, but the more I listened to him, the more I started to believe it." She paused, her hands shaking slightly as she took another sip of coffee. "Before I knew it, I was filing for divorce, cutting ties with my husband. Harris convinced me it was the right thing to do, that I was making the best decision for my mental health. But after it was all over, I started to realize that maybe I'd been manipulated. By the time I figured it out, it was too late. My marriage was gone, and Harris had moved on to the next patient." I sat there, stunned. Her story was almost identical to what was happening with Julia. Harris was following the same pattern, manipulating vulnerable women into destroying their marriages for his own gain. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Fear, shame, the feeling that no one would believe her. Linda looked down at the table, her voice soft. "I was embarrassed. I didn't want to admit that I'd been fooled like that. And besides, what proof did I have? Harris was careful. He never did anything that could be traced back to him." I nodded, understanding her pain all too well. "I'm trying to stop him," I said, my voice firm. "I need to get enough evidence to bring him down. Will you help me?" Linda hesitated, her eyes searching mine. "I'll help," she finally said, "but you have to be careful. Harris, he's dangerous. And if he knows you're onto him," Linda's words echoed in my head as I drove home, the weight of them pressing down on me like a heavy fog. Harris is dangerous. I'd known it on some level, but hearing it from someone who had lived through his manipulation brought it into sharp focus. This wasn't just about catching him in a lie or exposing his scam. This was about protecting Julia, and maybe even myself, from a man who wouldn't hesitate to destroy anyone who got in his way. I couldn't stop thinking about the way Linda had looked, her hands trembling as she spoke, her eyes darting around the coffee shop like she was expecting someone to jump out from the shadows. She had been broken by Harris, just like Julia was being broken now. The difference was that Linda had seen through the manipulation before it was too late, even if she hadn't been able to stop the destruction of her marriage. Julia didn't see it yet. She still thought Harris was on her side, that he was helping her, when in reality, he was pulling the strings, guiding her toward a path that would leave her in ruins. As I pulled into the driveway, I made a decision. I couldn't wait any longer. I had to confront Julia again, but this time I needed to be smart about it. I couldn't just throw accusations at her and hope something stuck. I had to show her the truth, to make her see what Harris was really doing. But how could I convince her when she was already so deep in his web? The house was dark when I walked in, the silence pressing down on me. Julia wasn't home yet, and I wondered where she was. With him? Probably. My stomach twisted at the thought, but I pushed it aside. I had more important things to focus on right now. I went to my office and pulled out the file Sarah had given me, spreading the papers across the desk. The financial records, the contract with the law firm, the connections to Harris's other clients. It was all here, laid out in black and white. The problem was that none of it was enough on its own. Julia wouldn't care about financial records. She wouldn't believe that Harris was taking kickbacks from lawyers just because I said so. No, I needed something more personal, something that would hit her where it hurt. I stared at the papers, frustration boiling in my chest. How could I make her see? What would it take to break through the hold Harris had over her? Then it hit me. The messages. The ones between her and Harris. I still had access to her phone, to the texts and emails she thought were private. If I could find something in there, something that showed how Harris was manipulating her, it might be enough. I had to tread carefully. Julia was already on edge, and if she caught me snooping, it would all blow up in my face. But I had to try. It was the only way. I grabbed her phone from the counter where she always left it when she was home. I knew her passcode, had known it for years. She hadn't bothered to change it, not even after everything that had happened. A small part of me wondered if that meant she still trusted me on some level, but I quickly pushed the thought aside. Now wasn't the time for sentiment. I scrolled through her messages with Harris, my heart pounding in my chest as I read each one. Most of them were what I expected. Talk about their therapy sessions, vague promises about how he was helping her grow and find herself. But then, buried among the mundane texts, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was from Harris, sent just a few days ago. You know what needs to happen next. Mark is holding you back. You can't move forward with him still in your life. My hands shook as I read the message again, the words blurring in front of me. Harris wasn't just manipulating her. He was actively pushing her to end our marriage, to cut me out of her life completely. This wasn't just an affair. This was full-scale emotional manipulation, and it was working. I scrolled further, finding more messages that painted the same picture. Harris had been planting these seeds for months, telling her over and over again that I was the problem, that she couldn't truly be happy as long as I was around. He was slowly, methodically breaking us apart, piece by piece. I had to stop this now. Just as I was about to put the phone down, I heard the front door open. My heart leapt into my throat, and I quickly shut off the phone, shoving it back onto the counter before Julia could see me. She walked into the kitchen a moment later, her face drawn, her eyes tired. "Hey," she said, her voice soft but distant. "I didn't expect you to still be up." "I couldn't sleep," I said, forcing a casual tone. "Just had some work to catch up on." She nodded, but there was something off in her expression, something guarded. She was hiding something. I could see it in the way she avoided my gaze, in the way she moved around the kitchen like she was trying not to disturb me. Was it guilt, or was it something more? "Where were you?" I asked, keeping my voice light, though my heart pounded in my chest. I didn't want to push too hard, but I needed to know. "Out," she said, a little too quickly. "I had a meeting with a client, then grabbed dinner with a friend." I nodded, pretending to believe her, though I knew exactly where she had been. The tension in the room was thick, and I could feel her pulling away from me, emotionally and physically. It was like she was already halfway out the door, already planning her escape. I couldn't let that happen. Not without a fight. "Julia, we need to talk," I said, my voice firmer this time. She froze, her back to me as she stood at the counter. I saw her shoulders tense, and for a moment, she didn't respond. When she finally turned around, her face was set, her eyes hard. "What is there to talk about, Mark?" she asked, her voice cold. "We've been through this. Nothing's going to change." "Just hear me out," I said, stepping closer to her. "Please, I know things have been hard, but you have to know that Harris isn't who you think he is. He's manipulating you, Julia. I have proof." Her eyes narrowed, and I could see the walls going up. "Proof? What proof? You're just grasping at straws because you can't accept that this is over." I shook my head, frustration boiling over. "No, I'm not. I've been looking into him. I know what he's doing. He's been pushing you, telling you to leave me because he benefits from it. It's all part of his plan." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You sound paranoid, Mark. This is exactly what he said would happen. You'd get desperate, start making wild accusations. He told me you'd try to blame him." My heart sank. She was too far gone. Harris had her so wrapped up in his lies that she couldn't even see the truth anymore. "Julia, just listen to me. I found messages between you and Harris. He's telling you to leave me. He's not helping you. He's manipulating you." Her face twisted in anger, and she took a step back. "You went through my phone? Are you serious? How dare you?" "I had to," I said, my voice rising in frustration. I had to, because I needed to know what he was doing to you. He's using you, Julia. He's not your therapist. He's your puppet master. She shook her head, her eyes blazing with fury. I can't believe this. You're spying on me, going behind my back, and now you're trying to convince me that the one person who's been there for me is the bad guy? I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I'm trying to protect you, Julia. Harris is dangerous. I've been talking to someone who's been through this before. He did the same thing to her, pushed her to leave her husband, then profited off the divorce. It's a scam, Julia. You have to see that. But she wasn't listening. Her face was set, her mind made up. I'm done, Mark, she said, her voice cold and final. I'm leaving. I can't do this anymore. My heart dropped into my stomach, the words hitting me like a physical blow. Julia, please. No, she interrupted, her voice shaking with emotion. I'm done. I've made up my mind. I'm leaving. And with that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, the weight of her words crushing me. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, like everything I had been fighting for was slipping away. She was gone, and I didn't know if I could get her back. As the front door slammed shut, I realized that it wasn't just my marriage that was at risk anymore. Julia was in deeper than I had thought, and if Harris knew that I was onto him, things could get a lot worse. I had to act fast. If I didn't, I could lose everything. I stood there in the middle of the kitchen, staring at the empty space where Julia had been. Her words echoed in my head, bouncing around like the final blow in a fight I hadn't even realized I was losing. She was gone. I had fought so hard to show her the truth, to make her see that Harris wasn't the savior she thought he was, but none of it had mattered. She was under his control, completely and utterly blind to what was really happening. And now, she had walked out of my life, just like that. The silence in the house was suffocating. Every room felt colder, emptier, as if the energy had been drained from the walls the moment Julia left. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to do anything that would break the overwhelming stillness around me. But all I could do was stand there, frozen, unsure of what to do next. How had it come to this? How had everything fallen apart so quickly? I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, the realization that I had failed. I had tried to save her, to save us, but I hadn't been enough. Harris had won. He had taken everything from me, my marriage, my trust, my life as I knew it, and now he had Julia. But as the minutes ticked by, something inside me started to shift. I couldn't let this be the end. I couldn't just stand by and let Harris get away with what he had done. Julia was still out there, still in danger, even if she didn't realize it. And if I didn't do something, if I didn't act now, Harris would destroy her completely. I grabbed my phone and dialed Sarah's number, my heart pounding as the line rang. She picked up on the third ring, her voice groggy, like I had woken her up. Mark, what's going on? It's late. I need your help, I said, my voice urgent. Julia's gone. She left. She's completely under Harris's control, and I don't know what he's planning, but it's bad. I need to find her, Sarah. I need to stop him. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear her shifting in bed. Okay, she finally said, her voice firm. We'll figure this out. Meet me at my office in an hour. We'll go over everything. I hung up and immediately started gathering the files and documents I had collected on Harris. If I was going to confront him, if I was going to take him down once and for all, I needed to be prepared. I needed every piece of evidence I had, every shred of proof that could expose him for the manipulative predator he was. The drive to Sarah's office was a blur. My mind was racing with possibilities, with worst-case scenarios of what Harris could be doing to Julia right now. I had to find her. I had to stop him before it was too late. When I arrived at Sarah's office, she was already there, sitting at her desk with her laptop open, papers spread out in front of her. She looked up as I walked in, her expression serious but determined. Tell me everything, she said, motioning for me to sit down. I quickly ran through the events of the past few days, how I had confronted Julia, how she had left, how Harris had been manipulating her from the beginning. I told her about the messages I had found, the contract linking Harris to the law firm, everything that had led up to this moment. Sarah listened carefully, taking notes as I spoke, her brow furrowed in concentration. This is bad, she said once I finished. Really bad. Harris has a lot of power, Mark. He's got connections, people in high places who protect him. If we're going to take him down, we need to be smart about this. We need to gather enough evidence to not only expose him, but to protect Julia as well. I know, I said, my voice tight, but we don't have much time. I don't know where she is right now, but if she's with Harris… Sarah nodded. We need to move fast. I'll reach out to some contacts I have, see if I can get more information on Harris's operation. In the meantime, we need to track down Julia. Do you have any idea where she might have gone? I shook my head. No, but she's been staying out late, meeting with him more and more. It's like he's pulling her further into his orbit, cutting her off from me. She's completely under his influence. Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious. Mark, listen to me. This isn't your fault. Harris is a master manipulator. He's been doing this for years, and he's gotten very good at it. Julia's not the first person he's done this to, and unfortunately, she might not be the last. But if we're going to save her, we need to be smart. We need to outthink him. I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. What do we do next? Sarah opened her laptop and started typing furiously. First, we'll try to track her phone. If she's still using the same number, we might be able to pinpoint her location. While I'm doing that, I want you to go through everything you have on Harris. Any emails, texts, anything that might show where he likes to meet with his clients. He's careful, but there's always a pattern. We just have to find it. I pulled out my phone and began scrolling through the messages again, my heart racing as I searched for anything that might give us a clue. After a few minutes, I found it, an address. It was buried in a message from a few weeks ago, a meeting spot Harris had arranged with Julia. I quickly showed it to Sarah. This could be it, I said. It's a private building downtown. Maybe it's one of his safe spots, somewhere he takes his clients when he doesn't want to be seen. Sarah glanced at the address, then back at me. It's worth checking out, but we need to be careful. If Harris is there, he'll be expecting something. We can't just walk in without a plan. I nodded, my hands shaking slightly as adrenaline pumped through my veins. I didn't care how dangerous this was. I had to find Julia. I had to stop Harris before he did something that couldn't be undone. We quickly gathered our things and headed out, driving through the dark city streets toward the address. My mind was racing with thoughts of what might be waiting for us when we got there. What if Harris had already gotten to her? What if she was too far gone to save? As we pulled up to the building, I felt my stomach drop. It was an old, nondescript office complex, the kind of place you wouldn't think twice about passing by, but there was something sinister about it now, knowing what Harris used it for. We parked a block away, not wanting to draw attention to ourselves, and quietly approached the building. The street was deserted, and the only light came from a few flickering street lamps. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. This is it, Sarah whispered, glancing around. If she's in there, we need to get her out fast. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest as we crept toward the entrance. The door was locked, but Sarah quickly picked the lock, and we slipped inside, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. We made our way down the dimly lit corridor, our nerves on edge as we searched for any sign of Julia. My mind was racing with possibilities, with fear of what Harris might have done to her. But I had to stay focused. I couldn't let my emotions cloud my judgment. After what felt like an eternity, we found a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out from inside. I could hear voices, Harris's low, measured tone, and Julia's softer, more hesitant voice. I exchanged a look with Sarah, and we both knew what we had to do. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, my heart pounding in my ears. There they were, Harris and Julia. She was sitting in a chair, her face pale, her eyes wide with confusion. Harris stood beside her, his expression calm, almost smug, as if he had been expecting us. "You're too late, Mark," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "Julia has made her decision." "No," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "You made it for her. You manipulated her, just like you've done to everyone else. But it's over now, Harris. I have proof of everything." Harris's eyes flickered with something. Fear, maybe, but he quickly regained his composure. "You don't know what you're talking about. Julia came to me because you failed her. She's better off without you." Julia looked up at me, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "Mark, I don't know what to believe anymore. I stepped toward her, my heart breaking at the sight of her so lost, so broken. Julia, please. He's been lying to you. He's been using you. I have proof. You don't have to stay here. You don't have to let him control you. Harris's face twisted in anger, but before he could respond, Sarah stepped forward, holding up the documents. It's over, Harris. We're taking this to the authorities. You're finished.